Again, my name is Stephen Gale, and the film that I'm working on, or that I have been working on, is entitled By Any Other Name, An Exploration of Afro-Amerindian Heritage. And this film essentially addresses the existence of individuals and groups of mixed ancestry, particularly African and Native American ancestry, between the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and how various things have influenced these individuals being understated within the general population, being historical events, documentation methods, sociological perspectives, the changing sociological perspectives, implicit and explicit biases, as well as oral histories. So at the heart of this entire film is African American history and genealogy, which is of particular importance because of the fact that it spans roughly 500 years, if not more, of presence in this country or in the Americas in general. So one question is, why is this particular group of historical significance, aside from their longstanding existence within the Americas being 500 years or so, people also identify as African American or Native American, and so understanding African American history and genealogy is important to understanding one's own identity. And I would also argue that African American identity is directly tied to documentation, as well as social standing and sociological perspectives. Sometimes more so than geography or geographic or genetic ancestry. So this complicates matters due to the fact that documentation is often limited regarding people of African descent in the Americas, specifically in the United States. And so much of that 500-year time period that I'm discussing has been documented in inaccurate forms, and often they're limited in scope, or they may be non-existent through deliberate omission or through circumstantial omissions. Specifically those of mixed ancestry, documentation is often very understated. So that's why I felt this era and these individuals or groups should be discussed in particular. So using a framing effects theoretical perspective, I decided to use my own self as the subject or a partial subject in the film itself for the audience and contextual understanding. So I used the case study of my great-grandmother. She is my maternal great-grandmother in terms of my grandfather's mother. She was, her name was Edna Pettigrew, and she was born in the 1890s or the early 1900s. And I felt that this particular individual in my family tree was of particular significance and a pretty good example in terms of discussing this issue of Afro-Amerindian heritage, because she kind of exemplified some of the issues that I wanted to highlight. So for one, she being born in 1890 or 1900 is indicative of the documentation methods that I'm questioning. There was not really any birth record for her. Her father was a former slave born in the 1830s in Georgia. Her mother was a mulatto woman of unknown origin, and she was purported to have Native American ancestry, which, when undocumented, was passed through oral tradition. And she was also documented as being mulatto, black, or Negro, depending on the various records. And I think, on top of that, her lifespan kind of spanning 2 centuries, 2 different centuries rather, was significant in terms of understanding these changing sociological perspectives going into the modern era. So, so to give a little bit further context, this is a little bit more of my family tree here. And as you can see, this is myself over here. And so I color-coded the tree based off of where different individuals were born geographically, and the green being Georgia. And so there was only one line of my family coming from Georgia, at least within the past 4 generations. So one of the things that I found interesting in compiling this particular graphic, which I think kind of begs for further study, is the idea that individuals of purported Native American ancestry through oral tradition we're almost, well, at least in my family tree, we're always tied to a documented mulatto ancestor. So I felt that there was possibly a correlation there, and I would think that if we were to extrapolate that and maybe apply that to other individuals, maybe we could find a larger correlation to actually study and possibly get to the bottom of some of this particular phenomena of an oral tradition being passed down within African American circles. One of the other things I wanted to note was, as you go further back, you kind of notice that the term mulatto and other racial classifications indicating mixed ethnicity or mixed heritage essentially die out within the 20th century, about mid-20th century. So in terms of the records that are used to identify these individuals, we're talking about property, tax records, court records, personal and professional correspondence, newspapers and other publications, marriage, birth, and death records, as well as slave schedules and census records. Now, specifically with African American as well as Native American individuals and people groups, with these records, this is where the documentation becomes integral, but also becomes very limited. So when we're talking about property and tax records, oftentimes you're seeing African Americans that don't own property. We're discussing, once you go into the slavery era, essentially, property is not exchanging hands very much between African Americans. There are free black communities and free communities of color, people who do own land. However, when you start studying that and picking it apart, you're dealing with a very segmented aspect of that population. Court records, you're also dealing with, again, a very limited scope. Professional and personal correspondence, given the fact that a good majority of African Americans in the United States in particular descend from former slaves. Professional and personal correspondence may become limited due to the literacy rates, as well as the outlawing of literacy at one point in time for slaves. So newspapers and other publications, you're also dealing with the issue of a limit of African American presence in the press, especially dealing with more positive things like marriage announcements, births, things of that nature. So you're limited in scope to African American newspapers or to certain mainstream press that would acknowledge African Americans, but sometimes, again, you're dealing with a very limited scope. So now you're left with marriage, birth, death records, slave schedules, and census records. Marriage, again, the further back you go, the more likely you're going to find more common law marriages. The more likely you're going to find more marriages that were not documented whatsoever due to the effects of slavery. Birth records, as I stated, my great-grandmother didn't have a birth record. Most people didn't have Social Security numbers until, didn't have Social Security numbers, period, until the Great Depression. So even dealing with birth records, it's touch and go. Georgia in particular didn't have birth records or death records until 1919 statewide. So you're dealing with a lot of limitations in reference to the existence of people, let alone specific people groups. So when it comes to death records, you're also dealing with intentional omissions, dealing with extrajudicial killings, undocumented lynchings and whatnot. So essentially, when you're looking for the vast majority of paperwork for African Americans, as well as African Americans with Native American heritage, you're going to be looking at slave schedules and census records. And there were only two slave schedules, slave census records, essentially it was 1850 and 1860, and census records, which we'll get into in terms of racial identification and classifications. So this is an example of a typical slave schedule. And so I have another one we'll go into a little bit more, but you see these different columns, 1 through 8. 1 is the name of the slave owner. 2 is the number of slaves. This record actually is creating an ordered list as opposed to itemizing the number of slaves per row. So that's an inconsistency that you're going to see in some of these records. When it comes to age, that's going to be column 3, sex 4, color 5. The 2 color choices would be black or mulatto. So you're going to either see B or M Mulatto, essentially meaning someone of mixed heritage, but that term changes over time, and we'll get into that a little bit later. 6 is whether or not this individual is a fugitive of the state. 7 is the number of slaves that were manumitted. And 8 is whether or not the slave was deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. So,
what did that word mean?
Idiotic?
No, the 7 that were, what did you say, column number 7 was?
7 was the number of slaves manumitted out of this list.
Okay.
So how many of them were set free by the particular owner at any given point?
Manumitted?
Manumitted.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And so this slave record actually shows who I found to be Edna Pettigrew's father, as well as her uncle. And down here you can see this highlighted area. Again, this is the same slave record from that particular county in which the enumerator incorrectly created an ordered list. This last row here is her father. His name was Wade Hampton Pettigrew. You see he's male, mulatto, 12 years old. And this is his brother just above him. I was actually able to confirm this through genetic testing. I got myself tested as well as my grandfather and my uncle. And we were able to find living descendants of the slave owner, John E. Pettigrew, who was actually the father of Wade Hampton down here. So with this slave schedule, one of the things that you're kind of running into is that although I've confirmed through circumstantial evidence outside of this, like through historical context and whatnot, I've already had my own hunches that this was the situation. However, I didn't really get it confirmed unless I used genetic testing. Because due to this record, you don't see any relationship between this individual and the slaves. You don't see how they were acquired, any sort of familial relationship, how long they were slaves under this particular owner. So again, in the documentation, there's going to be certain inconsistencies and certain things that we're just not going to see. So through that, I was able to basically determine Edna Pettigrew's European ancestry. Now, I wasn't able to confirm or deny the Native American claims. And so that's one of the things that I was most curious about, because I kind of assumed that, you know, that was one of the cases, that she was of mixed heritage by way of European through slavery. But the Native American claim is really what I wanted to get at the root to see what that issue really is and if there's an understated population that we're talking about. So, but when I found that information, it kind of left me with 3 different conclusions from my standpoint. And one is that there was no Native American ancestry whatsoever in that line, which was a plausible theory. 2, that the ancestry stems from Edna's mother, who was also listed as mulatto in various records. And again, we don't have very much information on her. And 3, it's possible that Wade Hampton Pettigrew was actually part Native American through his mother's side as well. So, and I was able to kind of narrow that down due to the fact that I did a lot of genealogical research on the Pettigrew line and didn't see anything that led me into that direction, the European Pettigrew line. So, Wade Hampton Pettigrew's mother actually was born in the late 1700s. So I decided to explore the idea of possible Native American enslavement. And as I started doing research on that, I realized that the institution of chattel slavery wasn't exclusive to imported Africans. So slavery amongst Native Americans was actually already prevalent prior to European colonial expansion. However, it was the chattel slavery system wasn't co-opted until a little bit later on. So a lot of the Europeans would actually have intertribal, well, the Native American tribes would have raids between tribes in exchange for goods and curry favor with the European colonial powers that be. And Native American slaves were also exported from the Americas abroad, as well as to the Caribbean, as well as to other colonies within colonial America. So South Carolina, as a matter of fact, was considered one of the largest exporters of Native American slaves at one time. And an example of this was a pamphlet written by a pamphleteer named John Norris entitled Profitable Advice for Rich and Poor. And essentially this was a brochure of sorts for Europeans in Great Britain to come to the Americas. Georgia, for instance, was a debtor's colony. So in order to get out of debt, you could come to the Americas and establish yourself and make some money and, you know, establish a farm. So John Norris was essentially trying to coax people into coming over to the Americas and plant roots by using slave labor. And so in this particular pamphlet, he discusses enslavement of Native Americans as well as Africans, their prices, the occupations that they would be used for, the uses of these individual people. There we go. And so this is an excerpt from that. And you can see he kind of outlines, 15 Negro men at 40 pounds each, 15 Indian women to work in the field at 18 pounds each, 3 Indian women as cooks for the slaves and other household benefits, 3 Negro women at 37 pounds each to be employed either through dairy, to attend to hogs, washing, or any other employment that they may be set about in the family. To follow that right by cows, calves, bulls, to really drive home the idea that this is a chattel slavery system implemented here. One of the things that I thought was interesting with this was the lack of Native American men being mentioned in this particular itemized list. And some would say that the reason for that would be because Native American men typically didn't farm within the traditional tribal structure. And therefore, the women having that natural, or not natural, but that natural tribal role, essentially, to cultivate plants and crops, that they would actually be the ones to be better slaves in that regard. So they were actually used to work out in the fields to cultivate the crops. And Native American men, they follow the matrilineal system within their tribal culture. Their particular status was based on the women in the tribe. So this would also be a way to disrupt that matrilineal system, thus degrading the presence of that particular tribe. So this kind of confirms or is another example of chattel slavery within early colonial history. And it's important to note that at the time, the colony of Georgia was actually far smaller than what we know Georgia to be today. So as you can see, like, this is essentially the shape of present-day Georgia. This red area is Georgia circa 1777. The colony of Georgia was about the same size, give or take. And by 1807, Georgia had only expanded out to the blue and the orange areas that you see. The vast majority of Georgia, up until 1820, was essentially Indian territory, and these people weren't stagnant. So there was trading between both people across the border all the time. So the idea that an understated population could exist amongst the slave traders between borders is quite possible. So it made me want to look a little bit deeper into that as well. The more contemporary version of Georgia that we see doesn't really show up until 1836, post Indian removal. So Native Americans were very much a part of the discussion when chattel slavery was introduced into Georgia. Slavery wasn't a part of Georgia's established law until 1755, with the passage of an act for better ordering and governing of Negroes and other slaves in this province, in which Africans, Native Americans, and any of those with any level of mixture were deemed as absolute slaves. Native Americans belonging to a tribe that was allied with the colonial government were excluded from this particular law. However, even though they were excluded, they would have to occasionally prove their freedom. Individuals that were free people of color, whether they were Native American or any other particular group, would actually have to have white male representation in the court system in order to validate their freedom. If they were to lose that particular case, they would be punished not to extend to life and limb. Now, again, that goes back into the idea of courts and court records not necessarily being as concrete as we would like them to be. So other legislation kind of follows suit. For instance, the Georgia slave codes were based off of South Carolina slave codes, or the Carolina slave codes. Carolina slave codes were in part based off of Virginia slave codes, and all of which included Native American slaves. So Native Americans being enslaved was a common practice throughout all of the colonies in the United States, or in colonial America. So jumping a little bit forward, now that you've established, once the United States was formally established, the first real window into who these individuals are outside of a slave schedule, and anecdotal evidence here and there, is the 1870 census. It's the first census post-emancipation. And the enumeration instructions were my particular focus. Essentially, census enumerator was told to go out to the communities and document the individuals. And racial classifications were determined by this person. So the individuals, as we do the census today, like we put down our own racial classifications. The enumerators prior to 1950s actually decided what the individuals were in terms of racial classification. So there were no instructions included in terms of how do you determine what individuals of African descent or of European descent. So it was strictly up to the enumerator and the social structure at large. People of Native American descent at this time were recorded as Indian if they were living on taxed land. Occasionally these individuals will also be placed into a category of mulatto, and occasionally they'd be placed in the category of white, depending on where they lived. The term mulatto also included any perceptible trace of African blood, quote unquote. So in 1880 census, this is a little more explicitly stated in terms of Native Americans. It states that Indians not in tribal relations, whether full-bloods or half-breeds, who are found mingled with the white population, residing with white families, engaged as servants, laborers, or living in huts or wigwams on the outskirts of towns or settlements, are to be regarded as part of the ordinary population of the country for the constitutional purpose of apportionment of representatives among the states, and to be embraced by the enumeration. Meaning, wherever these individuals live, they will be embraced by the enumeration and counted as that particular population. So the 1890 census is particularly important because it actually notes individuals of mixed ancestry and actually has multiple classifications for individuals of mixed ethnic ancestry. So you see they're added in, there's black, white, Indian, mulatto, Chinese, Japanese, as well as quadroon and octoroon. Now, majority of the 1890 census was actually destroyed in 1921. However, these classifications that were listed, just to go back a little bit, black was counted, but it meant 3/4 of black blood or African ancestry. Mulatto was 3/8 or 5/8. Quadroon was 1/4, octoroon was 1/8. And in terms of how do you determine who was 1/8 or 1/4, there was no specification in these particular records or in these enumeration instructions. So it was arbitrarily chosen, and many times you would see individuals choosing what they already know and what they're kind of subscribed to in society by that time already. So as I said, majority of this census record was actually destroyed by fire in 1921. This is a photo of the Commerce Building, the U.S. Commerce Building in 1921. And subsequently in the 1930s, around 1933, several more records were actually destroyed and disposed of. Only certain fragments of this particular census record actually still exist. So, but the census reports from the U.S. Census Bureau are still in existence, and they can offer some information as well. However, when it comes to the individuals of mixed ancestry, the numbers of Negroes, mulattoes, quadroons, and octoroons were actually deemed of little value, and therefore there was little analysis provided in the U.S. Census report. So, again, documentation is one of the things that kind of hampers this investigation. So as we go on with the census records, in 1900, you see how mulatto, octoroon, and quadroon all drop off from the census records. So these individuals are getting lumped into one of these particular categories. Typically, you would see these individuals moving into the black category, but we also saw people moving into white categories or into Indian or Chinese even, I've seen. So these particular classifications are extremely arbitrary. And one of the other interesting things to note was in 1910, the term mulatto comes back, octoroon and quadroon stay removed from the census records, but mulatto is also listed as an individual of any perceptible amount of Negro blood. However, in the 1920 census, the last time mulatto was ever used, it changes to Negroes with some proportion of white blood. Therefore, you're missing a certain population within that are getting lumped into something else. So, so for instance, an individual could be of African ancestry mixed with Japanese. In 1910, they might be listed as mulatto. In 1920, they would probably be listed as black. So it kind of arbitrarily switches back and forth depending on the individuals. And so it was not uncommon for people to switch essentially classifications. So this is a census record of Julia White. That was her widowed name. Julia White is Edna Pettigrew's mother. Now, this is the 1880 census in which she's listed as mulatto here. However, by 1900, you see Julia Pettigrew, and she's now listed as black. So automatically, whatever mixed ancestry that she had comes into question and kind of shakes up what we are looking for, essentially. And again, you can also see the name is spelled incorrectly, and also the name down here is spelled incorrectly. So you can see that how these records kind of constantly are in flux. And so finally, we have the Dawes rolls, which are integral to Indian or Native American tribal ancestry and affiliation and identity. And they coincide with the Dawes Act, which was passed to dissolve Native American tribal sovereignty. And so individuals were given land allotments, and as opposed to a reservation land for the entire tribe. So you have individuals who were even registered as early as 1890. And they're individuals of the 5 civilized tribes, which is the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole. And they are being enumerated on this particular registration. And even though this act was abolished in the 1930s, the registration rolls are integral and often used for verification of Native American ancestry and tribal affiliation. And based off of my previous research, the understatement, again, of people of mixed ancestry, of Native American and African American specifically, are not going to be counted within this scope as well, unless they were already living on Native American territory at the time. So anything prior to 1890, if that individual was not living on Native American territory, then they would be enumerated according to the census records, which we've already seen. So in terms of continuing this discussion and trying to get more at the root of what I wanted to look for, I was going to look into more documentation and surveying of oral histories of African Americans, as well as Native Americans throughout the United States, analyzing the oral and written histories of federally recognized as well as federally unrecognized tribes, expanding the research using genetic backgrounds of African American populations, and studying the migration patterns of Native Americans as well as African Americans and communities of color and free people of color throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries to kind of hone in on where some of these individuals that we may be overlooking through documentation as well as through possibly even government records in order to narrow some of that down. So I hope I didn't go too far over here. All right. So at that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Chen.
Andy.